The Rock discovered his Uber driver's heartbreaking struggle. What he did moments later left the man in tears and completely changed his life forever. Dwayne Johnson slid into the back seat of the Uber, stretching his legs after a long day. The moment the door shut, he felt it. A strange, heavy silence. The car smelled faintly of old leather and air freshener, but beneath that was something else. Something unspoken. The driver, a man in his late 40s, adjusted the mirror and cleared his throat. "Good evening, sir." His voice was polite, but there was a weariness to it. Dwayne, always one to strike up a conversation, smiled. "Evening, man. Long shift?" The driver let out a small chuckle, but it lacked any real joy. "Yeah. Been a long one." Dwayne could see it. Tired eyes, rough hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tight. The car itself had seen better days. The seats were cracked, the dashboard had a few loose buttons, and a faint rattling sound echoed with every bump in the road. He glanced at the driver's ID clipped to the dashboard. "James, right?" The man nodded. "Yeah. Been driving for a while now." He hesitated before adding, "Just trying to keep up." That last part hung in the air a little too long. There was something beneath those words, something unspoken. Dwayne leaned back, letting the conversation breathe. The city lights flickered past the window, casting shifting shadows over James's face. The silence grew heavier, pressing down like a weight. Then, at a red light, Dwayne noticed something. James turned his head slightly, exhaled, and wiped at his eyes. Quick, subtle, like he didn't want to be caught. Dwayne sat up. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was something deeper, something heavier. He had been in enough locker rooms, had enough late-night talks with struggling friends to recognize it. This man wasn't just tired, he was barely holding on. And in that moment, Dwayne knew. This ride was about to become something far more than just a trip to his hotel. Dwayne watched James closely, noticing how he gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, how his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. Something was off. This wasn't just exhaustion from a long shift. This was the kind of tired that sank into a person's bones. The red light stretched longer than usual, casting a dull glow over James's worn-out face. Dwayne wasn't the type to pry, but something about this moment felt different. He decided to push, just a little. "You all right, man?" His voice was casual, but the concern was there. James hesitated. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel before he let out a slow breath. "Yeah, just long days, longer nights." There was more. Dwayne could feel it. He nodded. "I get that, hustling, grinding. But you look like you got more on your plate than just work." James swallowed hard. His jaw clenched for a moment before he finally spoke. "I have a daughter. She's 7. And she's sick." His voice cracked slightly, like he had been holding those words in for too long. Dwayne's chest tightened. He didn't interrupt, just let the man speak. "She's got a heart condition," James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Doctors say she needs surgery soon. I'm doing everything I can, but the bills—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I drive all night, work another job during the day, barely sleep, barely eat, but it's still not enough." The car rolled forward as the light turned green. Dwayne could see it now, the dark circles under his eyes, the way his uniform looked a little too worn, the deep sigh he let out when he thought no one was listening. "How's she holding up?" Dwayne asked softly. James smiled, but it was the kind of smile that hid 1,000 struggles. "She's tough, stronger than me, honestly. Always smiling even when she's in pain. Keeps telling me not to worry." He let out a bitter chuckle, like I could ever stop worrying. The car fell silent again, but this time it was heavier. The weight of a father's fear, of knowing no matter how hard he worked, it might not be enough to save his little girl. Dwayne ran a hand over his face, his mind racing. He had seen struggle before, had his own battles, But this was different. This was a father fighting against time itself. James cleared his throat, shaking his head as if trying to push away the emotions. Sorry, man. Didn't mean to drop all that on you. Just been a rough few months. Dwayne shook his head. Nah, don't apologize. His voice was firm, but kind. You're out here doing what a real man does, fighting for his kid. That's something to be proud of. James blinked a few times, like he wasn't used to hearing words like that. He nodded, gripping the wheel a little looser this time. Dwayne leaned back in his seat, but inside he was already making a decision. This man had been fighting alone for too long, and that was about to change. Dwayne sat quietly, letting James's words settle in. The man had just poured his heart out, and it was clear. He wasn't looking for pity. He wasn't asking for help. He was just a father doing everything he could, trying to hold his world together for the little girl who depended on him. James kept his eyes on the road, unaware that Dwayne was now deep in thought. This wasn't just another Uber ride anymore. Something inside Dwayne stirred, an urge to do something, not just listen. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. While James drove, Dwayne's fingers moved quickly, making silent arrangements. He wasn't one for grand gestures for the sake of attention, but this wasn't about that. This was about a father who needed a break, a little girl who deserved a chance. The sound of James's voice pulled him back. I try to stay strong for her, he said, almost to himself. I tell her everything's going to be okay, but some nights I don't even believe it myself. Dwayne looked over at him, his voice steady. You're doing more than most would, man. You're not giving up. That's what matters. James chuckled weakly. Feels like I'm running out of options. Dwayne nodded, then spoke carefully. How much do you need for the surgery? James stiffened slightly, like he didn't expect the question. Too much, he said after a pause. Insurance barely covers anything. The hospital wants a down payment before they even schedule it. I'm already behind on rent. It's just too much. His voice cracked on those last words. He shook his head, trying to steady himself. I don't know why I'm telling you all this. Dwayne smiled. Maybe because for once, someone's actually listening. The car pulled up in front of Dwayne's hotel. James put it in park and turned slightly. Here you go, sir. Thanks for riding with me. Dwayne didn't move. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick envelope and placing it on the center console. James frowned. What's that? Dwayne met his eyes. It's enough to cover the surgery, and a little extra, so you don't have to worry about rent for a while. James blinked, then let out a nervous laugh, shaking his head. Man, I can't take this. Dwayne leaned in slightly. Yes, you can, and you will, because your daughter needs you to be with her, not killing yourself trying to make ends meet. James's hands trembled as he reached for the envelope, his breathing uneven. His eyes watered, but he looked away quickly, swallowing hard. I don't know what to say. Dwayne patted his shoulder. Just say you'll go home and hug your little girl. That's all I need. James clutched the envelope tightly, realizing that for the first time in a long time, things might actually be okay. James sat frozen, staring at the thick envelope resting on the center console. His hands hovered over it, trembling slightly, as if touching it would make it disappear. His breath hitched in his throat, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. This is too much, he finally whispered, shaking his head. I can't accept this. Dwayne leaned back in his seat, his expression calm but firm. Yes, you can, and you will. James looked up, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Why are you doing this? Dwayne exhaled, rubbing his hands together. Because I've been there, man. Maybe not in the same way, but I know what it's like to feel like the world's against you. To wonder if what you're doing will ever be enough. And I know what it's like to have someone step in when you least expect it. James's throat tightened. He looked down at the envelope again, his mind racing. "This is life-changing," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. Dwayne gave a small nod. "That's the point." For the first time in years, James felt the weight on his shoulders shift, just a little. But before he could speak, Dwayne reached into his phone and started typing something. A few moments later, he looked back at James. "You said your daughter needs surgery soon, right?" James nodded hesitantly. Dwayne's lips curved into a small smile. "I made a few calls while we were driving. Got some friends in the medical field. Your daughter's appointment is booked. All the costs are covered." James's breath caught in his throat. His vision blurred as the words sank in. "What?" His voice cracked as he spoke. Dwayne nodded. "Yeah, man. No more waiting. No more stress. She's getting the best care and you don't have to worry about a thing." James covered his mouth with one hand, his entire body shaking. His whole life had been a battle, one that never seemed to end. And now, in a matter of minutes, everything had changed. Tears slipped down his face, but he didn't care. He let out a choked laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. I don't know what to say." Dwayne smiled. "You don't have to say anything. Just be there for your little girl." James gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady himself, but the emotions were too much. He looked over at Dwayne, pure gratitude in his eyes. "I wish there was some way I could repay you." Dwayne chuckled. "Yeah, there is. Next time you see someone struggling, help them out. Doesn't have to be money. Just be there. Show up. That's what makes the difference." James wiped his eyes, nodding. "I will. I swear I will." Dwayne reached out, shaking his hand firmly. "You're a good man, James, and a damn good father. Don't ever forget that." James swallowed hard, gripping Dwayne's hand as if grounding himself to reality. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar. Hope. As Dwayne stepped out of the car, James sat there, his hand still shaking, staring at the envelope, then at his phone, where he had just received a confirmation email for his daughter's surgery. He let out a deep breath, one that felt like he was finally releasing years of struggle. Tonight, everything had changed. And for the first time in a long time, James believed that maybe, just maybe, the future would be okay. James sat in the driver's seat long after Dwayne had walked away, gripping the envelope like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing uneven. He had spent years fighting, clawing his way through life just to stay afloat. And now, in a matter of minutes, everything had changed. His fingers trembled as he unlocked his phone. His daughter's hospital appointment was confirmed. Paid in full. He read the email again, just to make sure he wasn't dreaming. The reality of it hit him like a wave, and for the first time in years, he let himself break. Tears streamed down his face, quiet sobs shaking his chest. A knock on his window startled him. He looked up to see a valet standing there, concerned. James quickly wiped his eyes and nodded, signaling he was okay. He wasn't used to this, people noticing him, caring about how he felt. But tonight, something was different. He glanced in the rearview mirror, staring at his reflection. He looked exhausted, but for the first time in years, he didn't look defeated. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out of the driveway and started heading home. But this time, he wasn't dreading what waited for him. No more wondering if he'd have enough to pay rent. No more late-night shifts that stole precious time with his daughter. When he finally pulled into his apartment complex, he sat in the car for a moment, just breathing. Then, with shaky hands, he grabbed the envelope and stepped out. Inside, his daughter was asleep on the couch, her tiny chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. She was still wearing her favorite superhero pajamas, clutching a worn-out teddy bear. James knelt beside her, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "Baby girl," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We're gonna be okay." She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. "Daddy," she mumbled sleepily. James smiled, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yes, sweetheart. Daddy's here." As she drifted back to sleep, he sat beside her, holding her tiny hand in his. For the first time in a long time, the future wasn't terrifying. It was filled with hope. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Your support helps us share more moments of kindness and hope. And before you go, check out the videos appearing on your screen. You won't want to miss them. See you in the next one.